Islam. That as long as subject Christians and Jews obeyed certain laws, these are called the Dima statutes, as long as they followed certain restrictions upon their behavior, they could live freely under Islamic control and practice their own faith, and they were never ever to be forced into conversion. And for the most part, during the early centuries, these societies lived up to that. There was surprisingly little persecution or oppression of the Muslims, or by the Muslims, of the Christians and Jews. So the gradual Islamization of society was peaceful, or was predominantly peaceful through the rest of the 700s, the 800s, and the 900s. It's just on the eve of the Crusades where we can start to perceive a difference. Because by the time one reaches, let's say, roughly the year 1000, there's no apocalyptic meaning in that, it's just roughly about the time when this happens, you reach the point where demographically, something just over 50% of the population of the Islamic Empire is now Islamic. And from that point on, it shouldn't be surprising that we can often detect a change in attitudes. After all, if I am the leader of this society, and I am an ethnic and religious minority in this society, obviously I can't really persecute you. You have the advantage of numbers, and you could easily rise up and get rid of me. So it's in my best interest, it's common sense that I will rule as tolerantly as possible. As centuries go by, however, and more and more and more of the population becomes members of my religious tradition, once we hit the 51% mark, attitudes change a little bit. Because no longer am I the stranger in your country. Now, once we represent 51%, you are the foreigners in our country. And while the official teachings of Islam, both the religious teachings and the state policies, did not change, is at the street level that one starts to see acts of persecution and intolerance, acts of oppression and violence. So it's not organized by the state, but it clearly is becoming a much more oppressive atmosphere. And that is part of what triggered the Christian response to have the Crusades. But that increased intolerance, that sentiment that something, we need to now flex our muscles a little bit to establish our control over these non-Muslim subjects of ours. It has an important ethnic angle in it. Because as you recall, it was in the year 750 that a new dynasty came to power in the Islamic Empire, the Abbasids. There was a Night of the Long Knives, and they got rid of the Umayyad dynasts, and then they took over. And one of the most important things that the Abbasids did is they moved the imperial capital. The imperial capital had been the city of Damascus, and they moved the capital to the east. And they built themselves a brand new capital at the city that they called Baghdad. And so they go from Damascus to Baghdad, and in the process, they begin a policy, or a set of policies, that historians now call the Persianization of Islam. What this meant is that the Abbasids had come to the conclusion that Islam, in its core teachings, in its core values, in its outlook upon the world, that there was an easier and better fit between Islam and Persian culture than there was between Islam and Western culture. right? Western culture is not only Christian and Jewish, but of course there's the whole legacy of Greco-Roman philosophy and mathematics and medicine and things like that. That the Abbasids decided that this is a better fit. And so what we want to do is to shift the center of gravity in the Islamic world over into the East, and they begin this Persianization in the sense that they gave preferential treatment to ethnic Persians. These are the people of Iran. Ethnic Persians, and they began to give them positions of political dominance. And they began to put ethnic Persians in as the qadis, as the religious judges. Ethnic Persians were now placed in charge of the madrasas. Ethnic Persians were now given positions of military command. So what's happened is that for many of the territories here in the West, including the regions of what will become the Crusades, right, is that in many of these territories, the ethnically Arab Muslims felt like they were being marginalized in their own empire. We, after all, were the people to whom God gave the great revelation. We are the people to whom God gave the Holy Quran. God himself speaks Arabic. Why is it that now in this vast empire of ours, why are we being shunted aside for these other people? So it's not only a sort of, I don't want to say a takeover, but it's a rising in ascendancy of a different ethnic group within the Islamic world as a whole. But it's also a Persianization in terms of the culture itself. The easiest example that we can point to of this, for example, is the custom of the veiling of women. The idea, the veiling of women is much more deeply rooted in Persian culture than it was in Arab culture. And this goes all the way back to the ancient Persian Empire, like Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes and things like that. And it originated not as a custom in order to denigrate or to reinforce the inferior status of women, but it was rather a gesture of ethnic pride. The idea being that in the great Persian Empire, no non-Persian man has the right to look upon a Persian woman. And that being the case, well, you can either blind all the men in your empire, or you simply veil the women when they go into public. So it was meant to be, or at least it originates, as a custom of ethnic superiority, not of gender-based inferiority. However, here's a particular practice which is gradually adopted throughout the Islamic world because, well, it accords well with Quranic teachings to dress, in a sexually modest way. And so we have different degrees of covering or whatever, but here's a non-Arab cultural tradition, which now also is now gradually becoming the default position throughout all of Islamic culture. So it's this feeling of being shunted aside in their own empire, which contributes to those territories which are led by ethnic Arabs, of them having a kind of hardening of their attitudes, right? A kind of resentment building up, and we see it expressed at the street level with increased violence and intolerance and injustice towards Jews and Christians. Finally, thank you for your patience, let's bring in the Turks. The Turks, of course, are a people. They originate far over into the northeast of the Asian landmass. We think they originate as far into the corner as over towards the region of what's today Mongolia. But over the centuries, of course, they have migrated across the continent. They are a very large, a very populous, numerous ethnic group. And when they came down across the steppe, the Abbasids recognizing that they were in trouble because all of these Arab-based states had broken away from the caliphate. They had declared political independence, starting first with Islamic Spain, but then in Morocco, and then over in Tunisia, and then what they called Mauritania, and then Egypt, and finally under the groups like the Ismailis, even parts of the Holy Land itself, declared independence from Baghdad. And so the Abbasids decided to use the Turks, this very large group of people, as allies. And so they had long since sent out missionaries to try to convert the Turks, and gradually they did. And so the Turks convert to Islam, and when they come down, they head straight for Baghdad, right? And what the Abbasids do is they send them over to the west. Over to the west. Not to fight against the Byzantine Empire, or to go over and conquer the Christian Europe, or to go over and do something about those troublesome Christians down in the Holy Land. They sent the Turks over to the west in order to put down the Arab rebels against their rule in Baghdad. And so you have the phenomenon of what was at the time a very effective warlike cavalry-based culture of the Turks. Newly converted and filled with the kind of zeal that one often finds in new converts. And they have essentially been given carte blanche to come over and conquer this territory and take whatever they want. Right? The land that you conquer, it's yours to hold, with the understanding, of course, that you hold it from us in Baghdad. So they come over to this region in order to put down some of the Arab groups. The Ismailis were their special target. So it's the arrival of the Turks setting off a kind of chain reaction of the ethnically Arab warlords in the region, right? That this is what created the violent and dangerous atmosphere, which ultimately led to the calling of the First Crusade. So the popes understood that it's because of the Turks and the danger, not so much that, it's not that the Turks were oppressed